let us officially begin with today's session. And I want to start with a poll question. Can you make an exception to your screening criteria without violating fair housing? So rental properties, you want to make sure that you are following fair housing, that you don't generate any fair housing complaints, that you don't discriminate, that you don't make exceptions for one person and not another, a person of one race or protected class. I know when I talk about this with large groups of people, I usually see a 50-50 split around can you make an exception to your screening criteria without violating fair housing. And I see a few more coming in, so I'm going to let a few more stream in if you're getting at that poll question or just thinking about it in your head. But why even talk about background screening at all? So many rental properties, you already have your criteria around income, criminal background, rental history, and credit or credit score, some combination thereof. Well, it's working for you, great, but sometimes you might find that there are renters who don't quite meet your screening criteria that you charge a double deposit to, or let's call them a soft no. And you might be thinking, well, I would be open to them with maybe some additional supports, but I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to violate fair housing. Well, today we're going to look at how can you possibly rent to a greater number of people that fit within your business practices and within your personal risk tolerance, also without violating fair housing. So what is the answer to this question? The answer to this question is yes, you can make an exception to your screening criteria without violating fair housing. But how? As long as your reason for making the exception is not based on their status in a protected class, you're fine. Let me give an example to simplify it. Many of you answering the poll question afterwards. I like that as an accuracy strategy. But let's say you decided to make an exception to somebody who didn't quite meet your screening criteria because you liked that they were working with an agency, or because they shared that their life has improved and you're basing it on that reason, or because they have additional financial supports that are provided to them. So your reason for making the exception is the presence of this agency, these additional financial supports, or something else. That is a fine and okay reason to make an exception to screening criteria without violating fair housing. What you could not do is make an exception. Let's say somebody has a criminal background and you were to say, well, I'll make an exception for women who have a criminal background, but I won't make an exception for men who have a criminal background. That would be illegal. Why? Because you are basing the exception based on a protected class, sex, gender. So as long as the reason that you make the exception to screening criteria is not based on their status in a protected class, so race, skin color, disability, gender, familial status, and on. We'll be doing a fair housing training at the end of March. We'll go through all those. As long as it's not based on any of those, you're okay. You won't get in trouble. You're not violating it. So a good practice is if you do make an exception to your screening criteria for a renter, then document in their file why you did it. All right, I made the exception because they're working with X agency, or I made the exception because they purchased this Beyond Backgrounds financial assurance, which we'll talk about here in a moment. That would be a valid reason as well, because it's not based on their status in a protected class. All right, let's keep on moving here. Now, I'm just wondering, among those tuning in, that you are an owner or manager of a rental property. So I know some of you tuning in don't necessarily own or manage rental property, but if you do own or manage rental property, if you would answer this question in that Mentimeter section to the right of the video window, is how much income do you require? 2 times the rent, 2.5 times the rent, 3 times the rent, or something else? Because now we'll get into the phase of this training where we talk about your existing background screening criteria and some alternatives or additions you can make to it to accommodate people that still may be very good renters but don't meet your initial screening criteria. So go ahead and answer that if you are participating in the polls, or if it's easier for you to scroll below the Mentimeter section and use that form down there for questions or comments, that's fine too. But whoever responds, we'll just take a look here and see, what do you require for income, 2 times the rent, 2.5 times the rent, 3 times the rent, or something else. I have seen quite a bit lately, a number of places requiring 3 times the rent in income. But interesting to see here that some of you requiring less than that or something else entirely. There are some properties they're even less concerned about that. It's fun to see, though, just that there are a variety of different ways that different properties tackle it, sometimes based on their management style, sometimes based on the properties that they operate. Sometimes you're just following the rules that the corporate office sends to you. Okay, but thank you for responding to that. So let's take a look at the alternative. So you have your existing criteria. Anybody who earns more than 2 times the rent, 2.5 times the rent, or whatever you set, well, they meet your income screening criteria. But what about somebody who is just slightly below that? Let's say they talk about it in advance. Like, I see that you require 2.5 or 3 times the rent in income. I don't quite make that. And I'm wondering if you'd have some flexibility for me. But let's say they give you a valid reason. I'm going to skip this poll question because I want to get into the nuts and bolts of this one here, which is, let's say you require 2.5 times the rent in income. That means they're automatically approved, at least as it pertains to your income screening criteria. But let's say somebody earns less than 2.5 times the rent. You could give them an opportunity to submit their budget. In other words, there are some people, they might be really good money managers. They might always pay their rent. They might prioritize rent over other bills. And if they submit a budget of, here's how I will make this work. Here's my income. Here's how I can make this work. And then you can review it. And if it looks good, like a good plan to you, then you can say, all right, we'll approve you based on the budget that you submitted. Now, there's some of you, they might submit it and you'd be like, it's still a little too tight for us. And then you'd send them on somewhere else. But this is giving you an opportunity to look at how will they make it work, because the income criteria is what? It's a shortcut where you're trying to determine, do they have enough buffer in order to afford to live here given life's needs? Well, there are some people who they have enough buffer, but you probably rented to somebody, they made plenty of income, but maybe their money management skills or other things got in the way, and that didn't end up being a very reliable way. And so this gives somebody who's demonstrating responsibility a way to show you how they could make it work. Or another alternative is to approve with Beyond Background's financial assurance. Now, I'll talk about what this is in detail in a moment, but at HousingLink started a program called Beyond Background, designed to support property owners and managers who are showing flexibility in their screening criteria for renters who don't quite meet it, around the areas of criminal background, credit score, and rental history, and any other criteria that you may have as well. And the way the Beyond Background's financial assurance works is the renter pays $300. It's like an insurance policy, but the attorneys told us we couldn't call it insurance, so we call it assurance with an A, but it's a similar concept where the renter pays $300, and then the property owner and manager gets access to up to $2,000 above what their security deposit covers. At the end of the lease, if there's any damage to the unit, unpaid rent, legal fees, or really anything else that was not met, a lease obligation that was not met. And so that gives the owner or manager some additional flexibility. And so one could say, all right, I see you earn a slightly less than 2.5 times the rent in income. In this case, we would approve you if you purchase Beyond Background's financial assurance, so that the renter pays $300 and then you get access to up to $2,000 if needed at the end of the lease, if there were expenses that were not paid. And so there's an example of an alternative to income requirements where it's not an immediate no for somebody who doesn't meet it. Somebody who meets it, all right, automatically approved. Somebody who doesn't meet it, they have an opportunity to either submit their budget or, depending on the details, approve with the Beyond Background's financial assurance. Okay, let's do another poll question here. This one around credit score. So what credit score do you currently deny if you use credit score at all? So under what score is it where somebody doesn't meet your criteria? If you have something else, you can just type it into that Mentimeter section to the right of the video window, just to provide some context on where you are at in your screening criteria with credit score. So take a moment and enter it in, and we'll see what the handful of you who are participating in the polls today have to say. Okay. So somebody who's 550 or less, somebody who's less than 600. Or if those of you who are watching are more on the renter side of things, you can feel free to type in what you have seen, properties that you're working with clients, what they may deny. Yeah, so around 600 for those who are tuning in, one at 550. Right, so what is credit score? Well, credit score is this thing where we want to see how reliably do people pay their bills. And that can be a good predictor of will they also pay their rent. That's the thinking behind it. Now, I will say I talk to 5 to 10 renters each day who are searching for housing with background challenges, anything from criminal, credit, or rental history. And there are a number of people that I speak to who their credit score is low, but they've never missed a rent payment. And I find that interesting. And so that, to me, at least as I view it, is a signal of, okay, that's somebody who prioritizes paying for their rent. And if they're not going to pay a bill, it's going to be something else that they don't pay. And so depending on your what stomach you have for it, it could be one of your alternatives that we'll talk about here in a moment could be, all right, well, if they have a steady history of paying their rent, then that could be an exception to the credit score. And what this also becomes is it can become a little bit of a time saver because it chews up a lot of time to have renters who aren't necessarily qualified tour properties. Many of them end up submitting an application, gets processed, they get denied, that communication goes back and forth. A little bit of extra effort up front might allow for being able to rent to people who would be good renters and a more efficient use of time potentially as well. Although, of course, adding some of these additional alternatives create some additional conversations up front. So there is that. But let me tell you a quick story about a guy named Josh Dye related to credit. That's me. So 12 years ago, 11 and a half years ago, I was exiting a difficult life event, a difficult relationship situation. And the person that I was with at the time, we had bought a townhome in Eagan in December of 2006. Townhome, Eagan, December of 2006. Now, if anybody can remember, some of you tuning in may be too young for this, but if you could choose the worst possible time to buy a townhome in Eagan, I think it would have been December of 2006, because what happened after that? That whole housing bubble crashed. Well, what happened is this relationship that I was in was ending, and we had to sell the house, but we were underwater. We owed more than that place was worth. And I needed to go find a place to rent. But I understood how background criteria works. And so what I did, so we had to short sell the home. Let me fast forward here. We had to do a short sale on the home. A short sale impacts your credit by 200 to 300 points. So I was going to go from a good credit score to a low credit score. But had never missed a mortgage payment. Always on time. 100% of the time. Never missed a payment. Really good renter. Keeps the unit clean. Communicates maintenance issues right away. But I understood the system. And so what I did is I made sure to go out and secure an apartment before my credit score tanked. And then I signed a lease long enough so that then when that lease was done, my credit score would have been restored. And so what I'm saying here is that certainly not for everybody, but there are some people where the story behind it matters. And that it may very well be somebody who could be a really good renter that if they struggle to pay some bills, it's not their rent bill that they struggle to pay. Or if there's somebody who they just understand how the system works, where a lot of people get unlucky is they don't understand how the system works like I did, and then they end up waiting, and then they search for housing with a lower credit score, and they have a hard time finding a place to live, even though it's the same person that was regularly paying before. And so let's dig into, on this credit side of things, an alternative. So looking at why is the score low? Is it that you had a scenario where it required two people to pay the bills and then the relationship was ending, and that this is a steady, stable situation on your own, but that your credit is low from something that is no longer relevant. That's something to possibly dig into. Or do they pay the rent on time but not their other bills? We covered that. Or in the case of what we'll talk about with Beyond Background's financial assurance, you can look at approving it with Beyond Background's financial assurance as well. Now, I know some of you might approve with a double deposit or a cosigner. Beyond Backgrounds could be a nice alternative to offer to that double deposit as well, is because sometimes we know that there's a lot of cash to pay that double deposit up front. And so what Beyond Background's financial assurance does, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail here, is it's less money for the renter than a double deposit and actually more coverage for the property. So it's sort of a win-win. Renter will have a little bit more money in their pocket to start off their lease, and as the property, you have more coverage than you would with a double deposit. So Beyond Background's financial assurance could be something for those renters. Let's just say you've got renters who, we'll rent to them with a double deposit. You could actually give them the option in this case. You could do a double deposit, or so our rent's $1,000, so we need a $2,000 deposit, or you could pay $300 for Beyond Background's financial assurance. Which would you prefer? And we've seen renters, sometimes they choose the double deposit. Many will choose the financial assurance because it's certainly less money for them and even more for the property. But on this credit one, just having an opportunity for somebody to provide more detail about why the score is low, and then you can check and verify those circumstances, and you might be able to approve somebody who will be a really steady, stable renter. At least giving that opportunity to see if that would be the case. All right, let's dig into rental history now for a moment. If you have any questions or comments throughout, scroll down below the video window. You'll find to the bottom right a form for questions or comments. So if you have any of those, feel free. Otherwise, I'll just assume I'm doing a very thorough, sharp job today. But rental history now. What I'm wondering is if you deny applications that have had an eviction in the past 3 years. So if somebody has an eviction in the past 3 years, is that a situation that you would typically deny? Is that a yes or a no? So answer that in the Mentimeter section, and we will take a look at a handful of answers here. Yeah, so one of the most common things that we will see in screening criteria is if somebody's had an eviction filed on them in the last 3 years, that is something that a property will typically deny. And so let's take a look at this for a moment. Because sometimes a reason that a person was evicted may not be relevant to their current circumstances. So it could be that they had a partner that was irresponsible and they ended up getting evicted as a result of the partner, but that partner is no longer in the picture. This individual is out on their own and they may otherwise make a good renter. So we could have screening criteria where if there's no evictions in the last 3 years, that meets your automatic approval. If there's an eviction, let's find out what happened. What are the circumstances behind it? And if those circumstances that created the eviction are no longer present, then you can make an exception based on that reason without violating fair housing as well. Because what we have here is we have somebody who's called you, who's toured your property, who's interested in living there, and you have this moment even before an application is filled out and an application has been paid and your time has been chewed up to sort out, all right, what options do we have for moving forward here? And sometimes there are none. Sometimes it's just a hard no, and that's how it goes. But others, you might have somebody who says, hey, I'm interested in living here, but before I apply, I'd like to talk about some things that are in my background, and then you can determine how to move forward from there. And then, of course, you're going to work to verify anything that they have mentioned. And so it doesn't mean you're just taking a story and not checking their background. It's you're hearing out the story. And that's like, okay, well, if after we check your background, this all checks out, that if what we see for criminal background is actually on there, for example, that you shared, if that all checks out, then we're willing to move forward with you. And then, of course, you will have the Beyond Background's financial assurance as a sort of new option as well. Okay, criminal history. Little poll question here. Do you deny people who committed a murder? Is that a yes, no, or an obviously? If somebody has committed a murder, is that a denial for you? So go ahead into the Mentimeter section and enter that in, and we'll see what kind of flexibility we have here. All right. We've got a couple of you who we've got a yes and an obviously in here. And if you're joining us late, but you want to participate in the polls, you can find that Mentimeter section on the right and then enter the code, and you should see the questions pop up. But yeah, we got a couple of yeses, no nos in there. So hang out here for a moment in that Mentimeter section. So which of these groups is least likely to commit another crime of any kind? So is it those with a murder conviction, those with a drug conviction, or somebody who committed an arson? So which one do you think is least likely to reoffend upon either serving their time or doing whatever the justice system said they had to do? Which one do you think is least likely to commit another crime of any kind? Is it murder conviction, drug conviction, or arsonist among these three? Probably should reframe arsonist to people who committed an arson, because maybe it was one time in the past and is no longer relevant. Yeah, actually, it turns out that I guess those with a murder conviction are least likely to commit another crime of any kind. Now, I realize I'm talking from the cheap seats here, and you are on the ground of renting properties and everything that comes with that. And yet, there are times where if somebody actually has committed a murder and then they spend a lot of their time and then they come out, they do need a place to live. And there is actually some data to suggest that they're not going to be necessarily as much of a problem as other types of criminal backgrounds could be, or not as high of a risk as it might otherwise seem. Now, of course, the details matter here, but as an overarching data point, it is kind of a fascinating one. I'll just say that. So what is an alternative here? So no crimes, or the crimes that are below your threshold, those are automatically approved. Now, if they do have a criminal background, sort of getting into how are things different now. So if somebody shares their story of here's what happened in the past, here's what was going on. When you check my background, you're going to see I have a felony in this or a felony in that. You will see, this is what you'll see when you check my background. Here's how things are different now. I've invested in my life in these ways. I've got a stable job. I've got stable relationships. Here's where things are at now. Well, then that can be a decent sign that this person is in a different place. Another thing to look at would be, did you participate in restorative justice? So restorative justice is something that is offered to both the person who committed the crime as well as the victim of some crimes in order to make things right again. And so the person who is the victim has to be willing to participate. The person who committed the crime has to be willing to participate. That can be a good signal of this is somebody who's really invested in re-entering society in a positive way. And so if you were to be a place that's like, all right, if you participated in a restorative justice program as a part of what you were doing, then we would make an exception. And you can apply that yourself to still specific types of criminal background you may deny. So you might have just like no stomach for some things. That's your choice as a property owner. There might be other things of like this category, if they have demonstrated effort to move beyond it, we're willing to make an exception. And if you do need additional support of the Beyond Backgrounds financial assurance, it can be applied to anything. And so that's what we'll be digging into here next, is just how it's available or how you could use it in addition to your screening criteria and any other alternatives you might be willing to consider. Even if you take it off the table, just having an opportunity for digging into the why behind some of these things and what is different now might lead to some more flexibility and opportunities to rent to people that are good for your business model, and also makes things a little bit easier for the renter in their search as well. Okay, let's do one more poll question here. Do you ever ask applicants to pay a double deposit or get a cosigner or maybe require more rent up front? Are there any of these scenarios in your screening criteria? And then I want to talk for a moment about, well, actually, I'm going to save that for the end. I do want to talk at the end, after we've talked about the Beyond Backgrounds financial assurance, larger properties with leasing agents that are representing the property, or even just on-site management that are involved in the application process. I do want to address something with that in a moment, but it is a good time to remind you all that the state of Minnesota landlord-tenant law requires that if you charge an application fee, you're required to provide your screening criteria in writing. So what are the things that you check for to determine if someone is eligible? And within that written screening criteria, you'd also want to include any exceptions. So what are the scenarios where you would require a double deposit? What are the scenarios where you would require more rent upfront? Or what are scenarios where you would make an exception for, consider making an exception for somebody who purchased Beyond Backgrounds financial assurance or has demonstrated working with an agency? Or you could even just have in there, something where you'll consider areas where you'll consider flexibility after speaking to a renter, for example. Okay, so yeah, many of you asking for a double deposit, co-signers, or rent up front in some situations. So I want to dig into Beyond Backgrounds now, where I referenced this earlier, but let's just go from the top here. So with Beyond Backgrounds financial assurance program that Housing Link actually started, Beyond Backgrounds, a little over 5 years ago, there were pilot programs around the state where renters had to get a referral from a specific agency or from a specific entry point. And then if they got the referral, they could rent somewhere, and then the place that rented to them would get access to this $2,000 above their security deposit if there's damage to the unit, unpaid rent, legal fees, or other expenses. Well, all of those pilot programs ended, and then Housing Link decided to open up Beyond Backgrounds to anybody that just needs it, or any properties that want renters to purchase it as a condition of renting at their property. But the model changed a little bit. So it used to be renters had to meet specific eligibility criteria and come through specific referral or entry points. Well, now there are no referral or entry points. It is just, if somebody needs to pay $300 in order for a property to be willing to work with them, then anybody can use it. So there is no specific eligibility criteria. Just, does the property need it in order to rent to you? Then the renter can purchase it. So there is no cost to the property. The renter pays $300, and then the property gets access to up to $2,000 above what their security deposit covers at the end of the lease. So it doesn't cover anything during the lease. So if a renter were to fall behind during the lease, it's not for that. It's the lease is ended because it came to an end, or if it was terminated early, then at the end of the lease, there is access to this $2,000. And there are no property inspections. It's quite easy to participate. What happens is a renter purchases online, then we send an email to the property to let them know that it was purchased. And then after that, we will check in by email once a month with the property and with the renter just to see, was the rent paid in full, and are there any other issues you'd like us to be aware of? We don't offer in-depth case management or a ton of additional support, but more as like a resource referral or sort of troubleshooting and problem solving is what we would offer there. But it is just a light monthly check-in by email. Now, one thing to consider before I get to that next slide is that Beyond Backgrounds financial assurance might be a better option for both the renter and the property in a case where you would want to charge a double deposit. Because let's say, just for easy math, that your rent is $1,000 and your deposit is $1,000. So in that case, as the property, you have $2,000 upfront that the renter is giving you. That $1,000 for the first month's rent plus $1,000 for the security deposit. And so that's $2,000 out of the renter's pocket. Well, Beyond Backgrounds financial assurance, if you went with that instead of the double deposit, is $1,000 for the rent, $300 for the Beyond Backgrounds financial assurance. Then that gives the property access to up to $2,000. So now the property has $3,000 of access at a lower cost for the renter, giving them a little bit more flexibility during an expensive time, which is often during move-in as well. And so if you did decide to integrate Beyond Background's financial assurance into your screening criteria process, this is the link that you can have a renter go make that purchase. When they make this purchase here, they go through a process where they then give us the information and you can move forward with the application process. So that is the link where a renter can make that purchase. And if you want a little more information as an owner or manager, we got a website here as well. Let me dig into this for a moment, though, just some of the nuts and bolts of it. So Beyond Background's financial assurance covers the initial term of the lease, sort of no matter how long it is. Let's say you sign a 2-year lease. If you sign a 2-year lease, Beyond Background's financial assurance will cover that entire lease term. If you sign a 1-year lease, it'll cover that lease entire lease term as well. If you sign a month-to-month lease or like a 3-month lease, Beyond Backgrounds will cover up to 12 months of that renting relationship. But after that, then it would be no coverage. Now, you could ask a renter to purchase financial assurance again as a condition of renting to them or continuing to rent to them to renew the lease. But we're sort of banking in some ways on that, not banking, but just if you've had 12 good months together, hopefully you could just move forward as normal, but you do have some flexibility there in terms of how you choose to use it. I've also seen places with renters that they had even greater concern about, ask for a double deposit plus Beyond Background's financial assurance. And so use it as it best works for you and your business model and can set you and the renter up for a successful renting relationship. So if you have any other questions on what we've talked about today, whether it's how to make exceptions in alignment with fair housing, remember, just as long as the reason that you make the exception is not based on their status in a protected class, if you have a specific reason that isn't based on the person's race or their skin color or their disability or their gender or their familial status or their religion or their creed, as long as it's for another reason, you are in the clear from a fair housing perspective. Okay, so with my remaining time, I want to speak to a handful of those properties that are tuned in today where you have site staff or leasing agents. So if you are just an individual operator, the rest of this won't be as relevant to you. Well, it might be a little bit relevant because I want to actually hang on. This is primarily for them, but I want to talk about when to encourage a renter to apply or when to encourage them to not apply, where the renter still gets the choice and it won't come across like you're trying to discourage anybody or violating any fair housing there as well, but just doing what's right by the situation. So here's what I mean. I talk to 5 to 10 renters every day who have often applied at multiple places and then they get denied and they lose $50, $100, $150, $200 on application fees in the application process. And one thing that I will always tell them is don't apply unless you are 100% certain that you meet the property screening criteria or you've had a conversation with them and they have said they will make an exception for your specific set of circumstances and rent to you. And so that is what I tell them. But sometimes it gets a little bit confusing for renters out there. And I've noticed this trend a little bit more at larger properties that have site staff or leasing agents on staff. And what often happens is that I think many properties, they want to make sure they don't violate any fair housing or come across like they're discouraging anybody from renting. And so you have a leasing agent who might say, okay, well, yeah, just go ahead and apply and we'll let you know and we'll get back to you. Or if somebody's denied and they ask why, a leasing agent might say something like, well, actually, you'll have to check with the screening company because they're the ones who let us know whether or not you're approved. And then maybe you can apply again if there's some other set of circumstances. But I think if you have a renter who upfront discloses, hey, I've got some things in my background I'd like to talk about before I apply, or something like that, that is a good time to say, hey, here's our screening criteria. Make sure you take a look at this. And if you don't meet it, what that means is if you applied, you would get denied and the application fee is not refundable. So take a look at this and make sure you meet it. Or if you have any questions about what this means, let us know, and so then I can tell you what it means, because sometimes literacy, ability to read or even understand screening criteria, even for those who have no literacy challenges, could be confusing. And so just providing some guidance on the front end to any renters who indicate that there might be some background concerns. I'm not suggesting you do it for everybody, no matter who comes up, although that might not be a terrible practice either, but especially for any renters who say, my credit's a little low, or I kind of got this thing in my background. Some people won't come right out and disclose it for a wide variety of reasons, but if they say, I kind of got this thing in my background, then you can say, oh, well, here, before you apply, make sure you check our screening criteria. And if you don't meet any of these, that means you get denied and you lose out money on your application fee. And that would be something you would not want to submit an application if you would not get approved. So take a look at this. And if you're 100% certain you meet the screening criteria, go ahead and apply if you have any questions about our exceptions. Or this is where, depending on what changes you may or may not make as a result of today's training, you could talk about, here's where we have some flexibility. Tell us about your circumstances. Tell us what's behind that credit score. Tell us what's behind that eviction. What's changed for your criminal background? Or are you willing to purchase Beyond Background's financial assurance? If so, we would approve it. So in some cases, it could be as simple as adding Beyond Backgrounds to your conditional approval requirements, but not necessarily encouraging renters to apply just to find out, but instead say, hey, before you apply, check this screening criteria. This is what we base your ability to live here on. This is what our eligibility is. If you don't meet it, here's what that would mean. Because there's still a lot of folks out there who don't realize that if they're denied, they will lose out on that non-refundable application fee. Some people still think properties are just collecting these for fun as opposed to it just being a pass-through fee. But we know that's not the case, but they don't necessarily. And so providing just a little conversation on the front end can save you time from having to process an application that wouldn't get approved, and save that renter some time and precious dollars in their pocket so that they can pursue properties that would be a good fit for them. And on that note, you are always welcome to refer renters to check out Beyond Back. Any renters you encounter with barriers who, like, they're just not a good fit for you or your property, no matter what. The part of the website that I highlighted here, that'll get them connected to some housing search tips. We have an online housing search coach. It starts as like an AI bot, but they can eventually chat with a human if they need to discuss some additional things in their housing search, and can help guide them in the direction of what types of places to pursue that might show more flexibility as well. So that is all that I had to share today. Hope you all have a great day.